pod listeners, welcome back to Urban Roots, the podcast that preserves place through story. Dappa here, your resident historic preservationist.
And Vanessa, your resident cities journalist. And we have a bonus episode in store for you today that's a little different than the usual. We are diving into Asian American history with Erica Allen Kim, an associate professor in the University of Toronto's Department of Architecture, Landscape, and Design.
Erica's also the author of a new book called Building Little Saigon: Refugee Urbanism in American Cities and Suburbs. It's a book that really inspires me as a preservationist. It dives into Vietnamese American communities across the country and seeks to explore why some thrive and others disappear. But before we get into our conversation, we have some very important announcements for y'all.
I have been keeping this a little quiet for the last few months, but I am ready to announce that I am actually expecting a little kiddo.
Ooh, got a little quirk on the way.
On the way, very soon. Too soon, because I am not ready. Everything is madness. I've just moved. It's chaos at the Quirk household. And because of that, I've decided to step back. So this will actually be the last episode where you hear my voice for a while.
And although I'm super excited for Vanessa and her family, I am also bummed that she won't be around for all the fab new content coming your way in 2025.
Yeah, I am really jealous of some of the episodes that Decca's lined up, especially all these bonus interviews with folks in equitable development. They're going to be great. I will be listening along with you all.
And I did want to mention one other housekeeping item that is also very important. We are currently in the middle of our end-of-year giving campaign. Sorry, not sorry.
That's right. It is the time of year when we ask you all to please make a tax-deductible donation to Urbanist Media, the nonprofit that Decca founded to help us do this great podcasting work we do.
You can easily give via PayPal or Venmo at Urbanist Media. You can find these links on our website or Instagram or LinkedIn or wherever you tend to check us out. And really whatever you give helps offset the costs of running the nonprofit and doing the storytelling work that we do.
Right. And if you believe that the stories of marginalized groups matter and that the places important to them need to be preserved, then please consider giving to Urbanist Media before the end of the year.
Okay, with that, I hope you're all gearing up for a happy and restful holiday season. Vanessa and I will be hunkering down, trying to get ready for all that's in store for us in the new year.
And now please enjoy our fabulous conversation with Erica Allen Kim.
So our first question for you is just who are you and what's your area of research?
My name is Erica Allen Kim. I am trained as an architectural historian focusing on North America, but my particular research interest is global migration and the Asian diaspora and how it plays out in contemporary, quotidian, everyday landscapes. We call it sort of vernacular architecture. I am currently an assistant professor at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. And I am a California transplant. So I grew up in the United States, but I've been living in Canada and Toronto since 2011.
Cool. I'm excited to talk with you today because, as listeners of the show know, we've spent a lot of time diving into African American history, the specific context around African Americans in the United States. And we, as of yet, haven't explored, the spatial reality for other minority groups as in depth as we have with African Americans. And it's not something that we've done like necessarily on purpose. It's just kind of how it's worked out. And it's been something we really want to explore. And so I'm curious because when you think about African Americans in the U.S., there's a very strong history and a very systemic pattern of the ways that African Americans were segregated in communities. And so you see those influences today in our neighborhoods quite strongly. And I guess I'm curious, are there kind of generalizations or patterns when we talk about neighborhoods or communities of specifically of Asian immigrants?
Yeah, this is a very complicated question, and I'm glad you started our conversation with it because there's so much to unpack. Compared to the African American, Black American experience, one could say generally Asians from Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Asia, their history is it's more recent in terms of just the sheer mass of people. Historically, there have been Asians living in North America, but in terms of the actual settlement, we're really looking at the early 1800s, but then especially around the gold rush, you start to see, particularly to continental US, a lot of migrants from China coming over as migrant workers, working in the agricultural fields and mining, as well as the construction of the railroads. We also see Asians who migrate to Hawaii as agricultural workers. And then, of course, in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, you have more of the merchant elite working in trade import export, and then you have a lot of those migrant workers then transitioning after the completion of these projects. They start moving from more different work camps and small towns in sort of rural America and Canada to these urban settlements where we start to see the formation of they begin to call Chinese colonies or then Chinatowns. And they're very urban and they're dense. And so you see from the very beginning this kind of segregation of Asian immigrants and migrants from the very beginning, from the work camps, the labor camps, then into these urban settlements. And a lot of that has to do, obviously, with racism. So, again, thinking about segregation, thinking about all of the different overt and covert tools that were used to maintain that kind of segregation, the fact that Asians, non American citizens could not own property, right? So they would have to purchase by proxy. So a lot of kind of limitations and barriers to how one could grow one's wealth, how one could occupy the land and construct buildings, and then even move beyond the boundaries. So, this idea of Chinatown, this idea of an Asian settlement as a foreign settlement, right? This idea that these are people who cannot be assimilated. We can see some parallels, the sense that there's always this forever difference, right? That then is played out in the built environment. So, you see some interesting parallels and then with the Chinese, like various exclusion acts, right? We see fewer and fewer people immigrating or migrating over. It becomes quite expensive. There are head taxes, there are paper sons, there are a lot of workarounds, but it's really a bachelor society. So that is a difference in the sense that you don't have this kind of traditional family with children in these communities. These are really just men, and it's dominated by the sort of bachelor society. They're not actually bachelors because many of them have families back home and they have children back home, but there is this, it's almost like they're completely segregated. It's almost like a form of prison, right? That you're stuck there working there, trying to make money to save and send back home. And so, in that sense, the built landscape and the social institutions that are formed in Chinatowns are quite different. At the same time, similar to African Americans, Black Americans, there is from the enclave or the segregated kind of domestic spaces, there are many examples of traveling or even living outside of the enclave. So, particularly if you were a house servant, you would live outside of the enclave, or you would have a laundry that would be outside of the enclave to serve various clientele. And so that kind of remained like this interesting sort of segregated enclave probably until the 1920s. And then we start to see a loosening of various kinds of immigration rules. And then by 1945 and the War Bride Act, the population explodes. It changes, and sort of the type of immigrants changes from bachelor, from southeastern China, and then you start to see more educated immigrants. And so they, because of certain gains in the civil rights movement, they are able to move outside of the enclave. They have more purchasing power, and so they choose to move beyond the enclave, and they tend to move into suburbs. I thought that was really interesting in terms of thinking about the way in which our understanding of Asian American spaces has really been dominated by, I would say, Chinatowns more than anything else. But Chinatowns, like, that's not the whole story, right? And we see how, if you take like Seattle, what's called the International District, where you have Chinese American, Filipino Americans, Black
Right.
Americans, like it goes on. And there's so many layers. And so what you see is every sort of marginalized, racialized group in the United States, they start to overlay on sort of the same like limited amount of land, of territory. And there's some competition, there's
Right.
some support, there's a lot. Sometimes it's just like one after the other. One of the sadder stories with the internment of Japanese Americans is not only were their farms seized, right? But a lot of their shops in Japantowns or little Tokyos were actually then taken over by Chinese and Black Americans. And that's something we don't really talk a lot about, that, in
Yeah.
terms of thinking about who kind of benefits, but still under this like rubric of white supremacy.
Yeah. No, it's funny that you bring up specific example of Japantowns in the US, because one of my follow-up questions for you was exactly on this subject. I don't know very much about Asian American history in the US, but I've been learning, and one of the ways in which I've been learning is we've been doing this project on Vanport, this lost city of Vanport in Portland, Oregon. And as part of that project, I listened to some oral histories from Japanese American folks from that time period, and they spoke a lot about the Japantown in Portland that was there, kind of a thriving community with schools, churches, laundries, restaurants, like the whole nine yards, like very much for the Japanese community that, as you intimated, got essentially kind of ransacked and taken over once they were rounded up and taken to camps. And then today, you know that area as Chinatown. You don't know it as Japantown because Chinese immigrants took over those spaces that were vacate or like forcibly vacated. Interestingly, as I've been talking to people about that history, like I spoke with a friend of mine whose grandfather had a very different experience of World War II. I think an unusual one, and that his Japanese family was in a small white town and was one of the only Japanese families in the white town. And when FBI agents came to take them away, the townspeople actually protected them with guns and told the FBI agents to get out of town, basically, because they're like, these are our neighbors, get the hell out of here. You're not taking them anywhere. I think it's an unusual story,
Wow.
but a very
Yeah.
interesting and powerful story. And it made me think about the pros and cons of enclaves, because for example, like these two folks in this white town, they probably had a lot of difficulty maintaining their heritage and culture because they were such a small minority, but they were also integrated into a broader mainstream culture. Whereas in Portland, the Japantown was isolated from quote unquote like mainstream white culture, and then they became like a target, right? They were like othered in this moment and they became vulnerable to the powers that be. It just made me think about just like Japantowns, Chinatowns in general, that's relationship between having these places where heritage can be alive and you can have culture and language and all of these wonderful elements of different Asian cultures, but at the same time there's also this kind of othering effect that
Yeah.
happens. And I was curious if that is something that has been like with geographical separation, that there's this maybe more vulnerability or discrimination or other kinds of negativities that can happen with that.
And I think it's a little complex too, in terms of Asian Americans having two different nationalities that are really coming into play and having existed within a similar space. And so when Vanessa is talking about Portland as an example, I went to grad school in Oregon and did work, adaptive reuse project actually in what they call Japantown, Chinatown. That like the name of the neighborhood is. It literally is both reflecting Chinatown and a Japantown kind of community. But the adaptive reuse project was working on a building that was an old Chinese laundry. So that's also like what I mean by complexity in terms of having this dual nationalities that have to
Right.
they both consider the space a place of value.
Right. And I think what we're all kind of circling around maybe is history, like it's all layered and it's complicated no matter what place you're talking about. There's always layers of different families and factions and rivalries and competing interests, but there is this notion of an enclave as both something that is done to you, like in that there are so many constraints,
Mm.
but also it's a strategy in the reality of those constraints of then creating systems of mutual aid, mutual support, right? And some of that is also constructing this narrative, this identity, or even, dare I say, branded identity, because we start to talk about consumerism and commodification of culture, that is a strong front that is presented to the outside world of who they are, that masks a lot of the dissent, the complications, the disagreements within the community. And I see this struggle across political spectrums, across geographies, whether it's, an ethnic enclave or not. I think
Right.
that is something to think about even in this particular moment. But the other thing we're circling around with this sort of, is it Chinatown? Is it Japantown? What is it? Is the scarcity. The fact that you have enclave after enclave on the same land in the
Mm,
same territory tells you
mhm.
something about where's everything, what's going on with everything else. Like that, there, it's the same thing in Toronto. There was a neighborhood called the Ward, and that was where all the newcomers came, wave after wave. And if you go through the directory, it's amazing because you flip open the directory and these guys are just knocking on the doors, writing down your name, your age, how many people are in your household, and your religion. Why do they need to know your religion? Because it was a question of which school system your taxes were going to in Toronto. So we would say, like, you're Protestant, you're Catholic, like you're Irish, you're Catholic, you're Jewish, and then it was Chinese. But it's so fascinating to see in 1 year, like how much ethnic diversity, how much cultural diversity there is in this tiny little footprint of a neighborhood. And everyone's just like jostling to maintain a foothold in that space. And then there is competition. There's sometimes competition, there's sometimes rivalries. Again, international district is the perfect example. Like, why is it called international district? This is something that was made up by the mayor of Seattle as this kind of multicultural kind of band-aid. Like, it's just international, but there's so many factions. And if you look at the Vietnamese section of the international district, they're mostly on the other side of the 5 freeway, things like that. So like you see these like little mini territories within the territory, and then the overlapping, and then the question of who gets to represent this territory, right?
Right. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, the Asian American category is broad, it's sweeping. So it's interesting to hear how some of these generalizations have been made that have categorized Asians in this way in Canada, for example. But I am curious how this interplays with your work and your research and like how it may or may not be, but I would assume quite be a bit different to be working or doing research within the different Asian American or Asian diasporic subgroups.
To what extent can you make these generalizations about Asian Americans versus do you have to drill in to be like this group in this time period in this location, you know?
I know. The academic in me is like, you always have to drill down. Like, you can't make those generalizations. But I will say the generalization of being perceived as forever foreign, forever
Mm,
unassimilable, forever having dual national identities, or that you have allegiances, right? This fear that one is potentially always a spy. This idea that one's national citizenship identity is always slippery. Like that, I think, is like a wall that we Asian Americans hit and again and again. So I think that is a fairly common experience, no matter how assimilated, how successful you are according to certain white metrics. You always hit that wall. The other wall is the exoticization, the orientalizing, all those stereotypes I think are applied. Like when push comes to shove, no matter who you are and where you live in the United States or Canada, like those stereotypes will come out in a very ugly way in certain moments. The other one is sort of the model minority myth, right? that we're all super intelligent and super wealthy, because you look at the demographic data and you look at the success, like you look at those charts and it's the average income of Asians in the United States, it's like whew, sky high, and it's like shocking in a way. But we know huge variation, right? Huge variation depending on each group. And so it's almost like every single academic article I read about Asians in America, they always talk about those things before they drill down. It's yes, we understand all those things, but now we're going to unpack or challenge some of the assumptions that most people have. But how does it then play out in the everyday experience of most Asian, South Asian Americans? I think it does afford certain benefits, I think, because of those stereotypes and those assumptions that have, especially the positive model minority myth has, I think, really overtaken some of the more negative stereotypes that existed more in the 70s and 80s. Like the branding exercise has been quite successful, I would say. I'm not sure who's driving it. It allows many Asian Americans to slip through and have this kind of adjacent privileging because of these assumptions, right? But at the end of the day, you still hit the wall of you're foreign. Like no matter what, there is that kind of perceived foreignness. And I think a lot of the younger generation are doing a fairly good job of challenging that. And they've been challenging it mostly by joining up with other racialized groups in the United States to create interesting things, right? That are seductive and exciting, and one wants to consume them like a Korean taco. It's complicated because there's still going to be immigration from Asia, and there's still going to be other ways in which those stereotypes are perpetuated.
Kind of coming back to something I do know about you, and your background a little bit being Korean American. I was curious, how were you able to engage with Vietnamese and Chinese Americans? Was it easy? Was it difficult? Were there challenges that kind of came up, or did people welcome you because they kind of understood that you are also from the Southeast Asian background?
So I would say, in some ways, being an outsider, but visibly Asian is an advantage because whatever concerns they may have, it's this person's outside of the community, but clearly interested and has this Asian background. So kind of gets what it means to be Asian in the United States. So I think there was general wariness of speaking to an academic, which I think is fairly common when you're talking to people about ordinary sort of places, unlovely things. Like people are like, why do you care about this? So there was like a little bit of hesitancy around, I don't think whatever I have to say is of any value to anyone, which I think most people who study everyday spaces and communities will encounter that sort of questioning. Also, the resistance came more of, we're too busy. We don't really have time. Like, we don't really see what the benefit is of having a conversation with you. And so, for me to try to explain what my work is and where the work is going and how they may partake or participate or benefit in ways that are useful and interesting to them, I think that was important. Sometimes I have translators. Often I have translators with me, particularly so many dialects, especially within the Chinese diaspora, that even if you are Chinese, like good luck. You're not necessarily going to be able to communicate. It's very clear, no matter what, that there is a distance between me as the researcher and the people that I'm speaking with. It's a distance that I'm still figuring out methodologically how to not overcome, but think about more dialectically. That's been a big challenge. But people are always very welcoming, very nice. And once they realize that I'm just listening and asking questions about them, which works at every party as well, is to just keep asking questions about them, they open up, right? And so for me, I think being an outsider is an advantage, but it's also a neutral thing because I think no matter what, when you're coming from outside the community, no matter what, you're always going to be viewed a little bit skeptically, but also with a bit of deference. They may be on their best behavior. I find that's very common. And sometimes they're not. And they say all sorts of outrageous, wonderful things. And I'm like, okay, that's off the record. And so
Yeah,
building up that trust is always really important, I think.
right. That makes sense. That makes total sense.
One thing that has stood out to me from the conversations we've had with people in the African American community is the importance of ownership, and that being something that felt so out of reach in for so many generations, and the onus that was put on it for future generations, and as a way to stand up against dislocation or displacement and gentrification. And I'm curious if in your research for different Asian American communities if ownership has been something of value or of aspiration, or if it's been just like not a tenable path for folks, or is it valued and striven for, and how has it impacted Asian enclaves in the US?
So, ownership is absolutely essential to so many of the Asian American communities and almost to a shocking degree. So, like I mentioned, when you were an alien, right? When you were not an American citizen, you could not own property. But once the rules changed, buying property was the primary goal
And
for.
what time period was that? Sorry, like
So we're talking like 40s, 50s, 60s, but really post 60s is like the big boom, right? Because that's when the country of origin quotas are dismantled and suddenly you see this huge rush of immigrants. And many of them, some of them are coming from a lot of money, but many of them are just working class or middle class. But what you see is one, a lot of Asian Americans are entrepreneurs in the United States. They're running their own business, even though they have zero business background from home, right? They're not a merchant class because there are a lot of glass ceilings in terms of employment, there's certification, there's degrees, like all these things are not transferable as immigrants. So they start opening businesses, and a lot of these businesses are family based, so the labor is quite cheap, right? Because you're keeping all the money in the family. And what you see are extended families pooling their money together to buy the store, to buy the shopping center, to buy the house, to buy another house, and to keep buying more and more property. And so it's shocking to me, but having conversations with fellow Asian Americans, it's, oh, yeah, we have 3 houses. Oh, yeah, we have 2 shopping centers in New Jersey. Like, oh, and to me, I'm shocked because I'm like, really? Like, how do you afford that? But it's the pooling of resources. Now, the interesting thing that is potentially different than African American communities and their relationship to ownership and this concern of displacement is that property is not thought of in the same way as legacy or
Mm.
as this safeguard against displacement. It's viewed in a much more mainstream capitalistic sense of you sell it when you're ready and you use that money for something else, right? So it's more fungible. And that has led to some challenges, I think, what for people studying Asian American built heritage, because there are a lot of people of the community who are not interested in holding on to property. They're not interested in any form of heritage conservation. They're not necessarily interested in that because they're also viewing it in this capitalistic lens of I want freedom to do what I want with the property and sell it if I want to, right?
Wow.
And so there are other Asian Americans who are very critical of this attitude, right?
Mm.
and feel that it's undermining the ability of the community to maintain itself for the future, for the next generation. And so I've been talking a lot with my own students and in my research about the importance of holding on to the property so that the next generation has a place to return to, even if they're coming from away or they even grew up away from Koreatown or Chinatown. This idea that through these kind of personal connections, you could maybe lease that storefront and have your cool little store doing your third wave Korean fusion kitchen. I don't know what you're doing,
Yeah.
or like a community space or whatever it is. Once it's gone, it's gone. And this is something I think this slightly older generation that has survived a lot of discrimination, a lot of challenges, and they feel understandably very proud of their achievements. It's a bit of a struggle to have conversations or to even moderate conversations because it's not me, but I'm part of different working groups and we have conversations. It's hard to bridge that difference.
One thing that's just sticking out to me from what you said is just the fact that the emphasis on commercial property is interesting and I think feeds into this dynamic that you're talking about because it's not necessarily emphasis on like residential or community spaces. It's like the commercial properties and that might also kind of reflect a bit of the prioritization on like why are we acquiring properties like you were saying in this more like commercialistic mind frame and shifting that because just because it's a storefront doesn't mean it couldn't be a community space but it requires a bit of a mental shift as well
Right.
so that's just interesting but
Also
I feel
kind of
like
becomes like where adaptive reuse becomes useful in other types of
mhm.
preservation.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting because my book really looks at certain ways in which different Vietnamese American community members organize with each other to make certain choices about how to settle and open up businesses. So you always see this kind of like concentration. It's like if you find one Vietnamese business, there surely will be like two or three more in the same strip mall because there's sort of safety in numbers and also visibility. And it's also just who you know brokering the deal and making it easy to lease something or to borrow money. Like all of that kind of the ethnic enclave
Mhm.
like economy is really useful. But there are cases like in Washington D.C. in Clarendon, Virginia, like there's this area where it's in flux because the metro is coming, they're developing it, the rent is really cheap, and so it becomes like a real sort of meeting place for newcomers, new refugee arrivals. But they also can see that the redevelopment is happening and they will be evicted. So
Mm.
the thing that makes it possible to build community very quickly and to gain an economic foothold and become entrepreneurs, they can also see the clock is ticking, right? And these are people who are just newly arrived, who have escaped, right? Who have very challenging circumstances to arrive in the United States, and they already see the clock is ticking, right? So it's a very ephemeral kind of landing. And a group of these businesses make a decision to lease a former grocery store in near Eden Center in Falls Church, Virginia. They make an agreement to say we want to lease this former grocery store, and there are like 30 of us. And of course, the property owner's like, yay, great, done and done, right? All my tenants are there. And then they subdivide the space, and then they are so successful that they keep expanding to create this whole shopping center called Eden Center, but they don't own it, which is
Mhm.
interesting. Sometimes they do own it, sometimes they don't. But that was a calculated choice that they made to relocate en masse as like a
Wow.
new business district. Like obviously other businesses were not maybe privy to these plans when they did not get to join this lease, but that's a decision that is made. And it's not just for commercial economic profit. These then become spaces that are really sheltered, they're protected, they're really interior commercial worlds where it's a safe place where you can have your kid doing homework, while you're working, and you don't have to worry about them getting hit by a car or getting into trouble out on the sidewalk doing who knows what. Like
Mm.
they're there with you. You can watch them and you can watch each other's store. Like you can watch out for each other.
Mhm.
You start to treat this mall basically as your home away from home,
This is so
which
cool.
is really wonderful, right? And so I talk a lot about how refugees, like Southeast Asian refugees, they bring with them a memory of how commercial spaces operated back home. There are a lot of arcades and indoor markets, and then these like French colonial markets that were created. And so this kind of interiorization of commercial life was always sort of part of the fabric. And then this kind of casual like occupation of public space for commercial activities like cutting someone's hair in an alley, like that's your
Mhm.
barber shop for the day and then you move on, or just all these petty traders. And so you see the
Yeah.
sidewalks and the parking lots filled with trucks selling things and people selling, spreading their wares on the sidewalk, and it's tolerated. It's not only tolerated, it's welcomed. And so those were like the kinds of stories and reconstructing and demonstrating things that are very ephemeral through the book. I think that was really important to me. But then there is this sort of sadness when you realize a lot of those businesses are now, they're aging, they're retiring, and maybe they'll close up the shop, or
Yeah.
maybe they'll sell the business and maybe they'll move on. And so is this just a brief moment in time, right?
Right.
That's 1 to 2 generations long and then it's gone.
I think that's a really good kind of question to ask, right? Is this a brief moment in time? Thinking about how what you're really talking about are like very specific groups that are actually coming in and reactivating a space that honestly, if you think about it, would otherwise be potentially not as like used or heavily active. Strip malls, indoor malls, large scale malls. And it sounds really cool like hearing these stories of not only in Virginia but in your book Building Little Saigon. I think that you the way that you use examples of different cities and different place-based stories to help really connect the thread. I should say that I really enjoyed reading your book because I thought that it was even myself as somebody who is in the higher education space, it makes me sad that so many books are so heavily and overly filled with just like citations of scholarship that would are also honestly truly necessary. Yes, I get it for like academia, but become and get lost and like the people who are reading the book get lost by not being able to understand certain contexts that were already like things were already discussed in the past. Like that's not easy for people to just know who are reading your book. So your book is essentially just very like accessible and useful for audiences across all boards. That's one of the things I really liked about it because it also really can move and change our field of within preservation and the built environment to get to start thinking about people in communities who didn't originally live in these places. And so within that, I was hoping you could first explain a little bit about what is Little Saigon? Like, what does that mean? And if you could just explain it in terms that like our audiences might have never heard of this kind of phrasing being used before.
Yeah, the Little Saigon, I think it's already politically charged as a word, as a name, but a Little Saigon can be as small as a block with a few buildings that are Vietnamese owned. Maybe there's a church or a temple nearby, but it's a spatial concentration that is not domestic, right? So it's not residential. It's mostly commercial or sort of these socio-cultural institutions. So they're usually shops that basically they function to meet the needs of newcomers, so Vietnamese refugees, Vietnamese Americans, the immigrants. So they have a practical function, but they also function as these third places where community, cultural expression, identity, like all of those things have a space to just be. So a Little Saigon can be very small, but it can also be very large. The term Little Saigon or Vietnam Town, which is another one, generally is given to this spatial concentration. It is not a term that comes from within the community. And I think that's important to acknowledge, because I do say Building Little Saigon, it is something that's usually named by journalists for the most part. The journalist, the intrepid food reporter,
Yeah, no, that makes
says,
sense.
oh, hey, there's the Little Saigon, it's the Mekong, it's this, that. They're always like kind of kitschy, a little bit stereotypical and slightly offensive in some way, where you're like, really? But it's a name that's given to this concentration. And then it takes a life of its own, right? It starts to become a magnet. And so it starts to gain kind of media notoriety. But then within the community, there's this awareness that there is a spatial concentration and it may grow. The name Little Saigon, as I said, is politically charged because obviously the name Saigon, the city no longer exists. It was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. And so it is an act of resistance and of commemoration, right? Of a homeland and of a capital city that no longer exists. And so the decision to call it Little Saigon, right, this sort of commemorative thing, is also a political statement. And so when we say Little Saigon, essentially we're saying that both the media and the community itself are somewhat in agreement of this political stance, which is an anti-communist stance, but also when you say Little Saigon, it centers the refugees of the war.
Okay.
It centers them as this is their new kind of homeland. And this can be seen as problematic because we do have quite a few Vietnamese immigrants who would not consider themselves refugees of the war and who are literally not classified as refugees. And so they may have actually grown up in the post war Vietnam, and their attitude, their political affiliations are different. But generally, and I can't speak for everyone, but generally, and maybe you guys have your own experiences with this and with enclave names, is that most people from within the community do not refer to it, even in their language, as,
Right.
Little Saigon. And I was laughing with some friends about it because often it's called Bolsa, right? That's the main street of the Little Saigon in Westminster. And so you say, are you going to Bolsa? Right? You're not saying,
Bolsa.
because it's Bolsa Avenue. So you say,
Oh,
are you going to Bolsa? And for Korean Americans, we have a small Koreatown on Garden Grove Boulevard, and we never called it Koreatown. It was always, are you going to Garden Grove
okay.
on Saturday? Like, are you going to Garden Grove? Which is
So it's just like
interesting.
the name of the street. Like it's not
Yeah.
even like the name of something coming from a reference from the culture.
And the thing that is interesting for me is like trying to imagine like the strangeness of this kind of naming of an enclave by people from outside the community. As
Mm.
an American, like obviously I'm an Asian American, but as an American living in Canada, I do not actively seek out the little America neighborhood. Like it's
Mm.
laughable.
Yeah.
And so I sometimes feel troubled by enclave naming, and I sometimes feel troubled, like these are my own like ethical, like 3 a.m.
Hmm.
conversations I have with myself where I'm like, Erica, why are you complicit in this kind of stereotyping and reproduction of these differences that are imposed by people outside the community for, financial gain? Like, why are you doing this?
This actually takes me to the thing I wanted to ask you, which was like, because I'm assuming that you had questions in your mind that you wanted to figure out by writing this book. And so, what were those central questions that you wanted to explore? And I'm assuming that because of those questions, you went to certain people to get answers or solutions. So, what was in your mind as you took on this project?
So, the biggest question for me was, why do some little Saigons persist and grow bigger and gain more notoriety and more political power and more economic power? And why do most others, disappear after not even a generation? Like, who's making these decisions? How is this happening? Are these external forces at play? Are these the people with power and money making these choices? Or are these just the critical mass of individual choices? Like, what's happening? Because the general story for communities, like these kinds of communities, is that they come together in mutual support and protection and information sharing, and it serves a purpose, but the ultimate goal is to access the social mobility that they feel is promised to them in North America. That's the dream. And maybe a new kind of cultural community will form that is no longer dependent on physical proximity, the physical enclave. It becomes a different kind of cherry picked cultural community that's scattered across. And I was trying to understand if that is a dominant sort of pattern that we see over and over again for all these communities, why are some of these little Saigons so big? Right. And so prominent that they even have their own urban design guidelines. Like, it's amazing to me, right? Where they
Yeah,
specify
that's pretty interesting.
different kinds of architectural styles, and there are huge debates about the naming and the boundaries, and it's a very politicized thing. And I thought the people who are really going to help me understand this are those people, the
Yeah.
developers and the city planners and the so-called leaders of the community that are leaders in a very public facing way, not necessarily within the community. There's much more complexity, right?
Mhm.
And so I knew that I had limited resources and time, and I wanted to talk to those people and understand, like, I knew what they were saying to the press,
Mhm.
right? But I wanted to have them say the story again, why this place is important and why things are changing and why maybe all the stores are closing or why maybe they're putting in these design guidelines or memorials, like, and just listen carefully to what they are or are not saying. I
Mhm.
found I wanted to peel back the layers from even what was happening in interviews or oral histories or newspaper articles that had already been published. I wanted to talk to them again and just see if they were saying the same thing or if there are these moments where you could see a bit of ambivalence or conflict, indifference, sadness. Like, I just wanted to know. I was really almost, I'm obviously not a full on trained ethnographer, but I was just plumbing the depths of these people who are supposedly the movers and shakers. And if I could do this book again, and I had a whole team of people with me, I would really want to work with Vietnamese Americans in particular who are building those oral histories, who are going into the
Okay.
communities and doing the storytelling. But
Yeah.
I needed to capture this moment because I also felt like I was racing against time. Because when I was working on the book, sort of 2006 to 2010, there was a huge building boom. Like, that was like peak subprime mortgages, like money was just like flowing like champagne. Stuff was getting built like crazy. And I could see something could be changing. One, like, this accelerated development was happening, and I needed to chat with these developers and planners in that moment because I wanted to know, like, what's happening, like the snapshot view, but also knowing bubbles always burst, right? And so
Yeah.
for me, I needed to like document the built landscape. I need to document the shops and like a lot of, you could already see like the decline of certain shopping
Mhm.
centers. And I need to photograph these things because nobody was really photographing
Yeah.
them. No one was drawing them. No one was mapping them. No one was making lists of what was there because no one really seemed to care
Right.
that was
Yeah.
happening. And I thought, at least this is a snapshot in time. And I want to hear how developers explained this transformation to me as well
Mhm.
as to themselves. I also felt there was this growing population of Vietnamese Americans who have the skills and the contacts and the interest and the desire to start building those oral histories, to do the storytelling. And I thought, that's not my job. That's not my place because
Right.
I'm really a built environment historian. That's what I focus on. And so I needed to understand the people who were actually making the decisions of how to build, where to build, and why to build. And then
Yeah.
the occupation of space, I was like, I need to understand that as well, but in a more historical way to reconstruct it. And then that creates this almost background context for filling it in with much deeper storytelling efforts.
So this is exactly why we take such care and have so much passion in doing the Urban Roots podcast work with the narrative storytelling. For us, that's obviously like the oral histories really integral to being able to do that. And I'm curious, how did you utilize these oral histories? What did that look like for you and your process? And if you want, you can also maybe provide an example that could be specific to one of the places that you focused on in your book.
Yeah, so I am lucky in the sense that there is the Southeast Asian American Archive at UC Irvine. And so already in the 80s and 90s, researchers were collecting oral histories of Vietnamese Americans in Southern California. So there are these wonderful transcripts that I was already able to access, which was really helpful. And they also collect all kinds of ephemera, different kinds of documents, photographs, personal stories. And so that became like a baseline for kind of understanding the history. And then there was a lot of research that was the sort of first wave kind of scholarship among Vietnamese American history. And so that was like the baseline of knowledge for me. And so I was sifting through all of that. I also spent a lot of time going through like basically every newspaper article I could find and then talking to Jeff Brody, who was on the Little Saigon beat for ages and through the Orange County Register. And so he was really tapped into the community. He knew certain people really well. And so that helped me flesh out like when I'm reading these newspaper articles, interviewing these people, like who are these people? Like, because there's so much that's missed. And so he was like, it wasn't really an oral history, but he was like this informant who helped me understand the lay of the land so I could interpret all of these voices, all of these stories that had already been published. And then I knew I needed to add another layer of oral history. And I knew that I had very limited time and resources. So I had to be strategic about whom I would want to speak to because I needed to know which people, in terms of the kinds of questions that I had about the changes to the built landscape, who are the people that I needed to spend more time talking to. Because the wonderful thing about oral history is that if you allow it to just unfold the way it unfolds, it's lovely and surprising, but also incredibly time consuming. And so I was not in a position to be able to have that luxury. And so one person that I spoke to, she was a real estate developer, Pamela No Trampart, slightly younger. And so we had all these conversations about what was happening to Midtown Houston, which was the first place, the first area that Vietnamese refugees settled. They were settling near the old Chinatown, but then adjacent to, they were settling in this kind of forgotten bit of Main Street, Houston. And they opened up all these shops, they repurposed like grocery stores and all these different spaces and created like a real lively, what you call a little Saigon for maybe like 10, 15 years. It was very short lived, but she like our conversations, like mostly I was just listening to her. You know, she's renovating this store and she's making a new shopping center, and like I would just ask her questions like, oh, well, who's going to be like, who are you looking to be tenants in this shopping center? And what are your thoughts about all the Vietnamese businesses moving to suburbs, for example, to Bel Air? Like, that's really interesting. Like, I'm starting to see that. And her responses were at first like, because she was just in that real estate development mindset, she was just very positive Like these are all good things that are happening. Like it's good wealth for the community. It's good to see the revitalization of Midtown. We're not really thinking of it in terms of displacement, right? And for me, like my eyes, I'm thinking, oh, this is very sad. There's no markers of even the memory. She's like, oh yeah, well, there's a pavilion, this or that. And the more we talked, and she started talking about the Midtown with a bit more nostalgia and not longing, but this sort of sadness, which you don't hear very often with real estate developers. So I
Yeah.
thought that was kind of a poignant moment. And she said, well, the best we can do is just remember that it was there.
Hmm.
And I thought,
Wow.
whoa, okay. So,
But
because
how?
because I said, "Whoa, well, this building that was the anchor of the Little Saigon is going to be completely torn down." Not only was it an anchor, it's like architecturally significant. It broke my heart.
Mm.
You know, it's like this classic. Anyways, I can't go into it, but like gone, right? And I was like, nothing, like no commemorative plaque, no like architectural references, not even the standard preservation, like nothing. And she was like, that's the best we can do. We just
Hmm.
remember.
So for the people that you were talking to, both folks living in these communities, but also the ones developing them, leading them, what did preservation mean to them? I guess was preservation on their mind, and if it was, what did it mean?
So for the civic boosters, the preservation generally meant the standard kind of placemaking elements, like a heritage pavilion. That's usually the most common thing. And these are communities where I think there's displacement is imminent. And so it's like, we'll just leave a few markers of our history behind. Sometimes heritage meant signage. So changing street signs to commemorative signage, right? And so working with the city to have those signs installed. Sometimes it's about just another sign saying, welcome to Little Saigon. Like that's a form of heritage. But a lot of the conversations around heritage, except for Little Saigon, Westminster, which is special with the design guidelines, was really memorials. So, memorials, monuments, particularly to the Vietnam War, that was where heritage kind of efforts really focused on more than
Hmm.
anything else. And there's this like real kind of pragmatism of, well, the community is shifting to the suburbs, so we have to follow.
Is that even useful to be like for folks outsiders, I suppose, thinking about monuments to the war when that has a complex, like really contentious history? I don't feel like that particularly might reflect the values of the community.
No, so this is the tricky thing. So the Vietnam War memorials that were constructed during the 90s and early 2000s have a very conservative bent, but their intention was to remind Americans as well as the younger generation of the political circumstances of exile and
Mm.
to reorient the narrative about the winners and losers of the war. So, in some ways, I would say that it was kind of central to their idea of refugee heritage. This idea that their identity is shaped by being forced to leave, being exiles, but also being viewed as people with agency, where this was a civil war against communism in which Americans assisted, sort of rewriting that narrative to say that the South Vietnamese government, which was problematic, and the army played an important role in the name of democracy. And so, by creating memorials to the Vietnam War, in which you have a South Vietnamese soldier represented and represented side by side with an American soldier, was like a pretty provocative choice because they're arguing against a dominant way that these memorials center Americans. There's that kind of like strategy, but the heritage part, I agree, it is strange. But that says a lot about that first generation and their priorities,
Hmm.
right? In terms of like how they want to present themselves as Vietnamese Americans and also as refugees, as political exiles. And I think that kind of understanding of heritage is now shifting with the younger generation. So that you have these like really interesting, there's a Vietnamese diaspora memorial that's slated to be completed in Boston, and it's a second generation Vietnamese American artist, and she decided to collect stories. She had a series of storytelling community consultation events where people were like sketching and drawing and model making and just sharing their stories of what it means, like what the impact of the Vietnam War had on families. So I've been really excited about that project because she's actively soliciting their thoughts and feelings and stories about what it means to be Vietnamese American. But I do find it interesting when I Google it, often it's called in the press the Vietnam War Memorial still.
Hmm.
And that's
Okay.
kind of the power. So, like, Chinatown is a very powerful moniker that
Mm.
hides a lot of difference even within a
Right.
Chinatown. The Vietnam War becomes this catch-all phrase.
I think that's where it's problematic.
It's problematic, exactly. And so the language needs to shift and the tools need to shift. And then the built landscape, the material artifacts needs to shift as well. Like all of these things need to shift. And I think it's happening, but it's slow
Yeah.
because I think we are just generally conservative as society.
You mentioned that there's like a practical realization that folks are shifting to the suburbs. So I didn't 100% understand what you meant by that. What does that mean in terms of preservation? Are you saying that because folks are shifting to the suburbs, you feel like people are saying, what's the point of preserving in the urban fabric?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. One is that a lot of the little Saigons that were urban, sort of more closer to the historic core, because they only existed for a very short period of time, when a lot of the businesses and residents moved out to the suburbs, there was this feeling that there wasn't even that much to preserve. So they
Mhm.
hadn't really built enough of kind of a history and like
I
roots,
see.
like similar to Chinatown, to say, yes, like we're going to rally around this. And
Mm.
now with the suburban kind of spread of people, it's like there's strip malls, there's shopping centers. And this is part of the value judgment of preservation, is that most of these buildings and landscapes are not considered to be worth preserving. And so
Mm.
that's why you end up with places like Little Saigon and Westminster, which is literally the classic American suburb, where they have manufactured heritage in architecture through theming, that they, from the very beginning, these entrepreneurs, they were calling it a Disneyland, right? That they were going to make it look like a Little Saigon. And then they hire the Urban Land Institute, the real estate think tank, to basically come up with what this Little Saigon could be for generations to come. And they're basically Chinatowning it in the suburbs. And so it's like, what kind of heritage is that? There are obviously attachments to it. And I talk a lot about that in my book, looking at Little Saigon and the urban design history and the politics around the urban design. But like, is that heritage? Yes and no, because this concentration of Vietnamese, because of the notoriety and because there's just like Vietnamese Americans control City Hall and they control the plant. Like they have so much political power and economic power in Westminster now, that it's actually a magnet for more and more Vietnamese Americans to move to Little Saigon. And that's actually counters all of the other Asian American groups in California, for example, where they're actually dispersing. It's a really weird demographic thing that's been happening. It's that they're actually growing. And I think that's like another book or another
Right.
chapter or another, who knows?
The
but
next book.
but you know, a lot of my work is on the suburbs, which just historically, even in just architectural history, is not really seen as having anything worth preserving. And I will say, I was listening to your other podcast with Justin Garrett Moore, And he was talking
Mm-hmm.
about maintenance and care and
Yeah.
like the problem with that and preservation. And I love that podcast because I immediately was thinking architectural history and architecture has a post occupancy problem.
100%.
Yeah.
And the post occupancy problem is also a problem of this kind of refusal to understand how wave after wave of people use these buildings and spaces and transform them, and how that adds to the richness of our collective stories, but that they are also actively maintaining and caring for these buildings and living in these buildings. And I thought I would love for all of the discourse around preservation to shift to think about maintenance and care and post occupancy and
Same.
legacy. What are we inheriting?
Yeah. No, I
Yeah.
definitely feel that too. I'm now able to finally like dive into this in my work in school where I'm able to like go in and really evaluate and question, what is equitable development? Who's been defining this? Why have they been using this term? How long have they been using this term? And hopefully then through that process of reading and writing and learning more about the people who've been trying to make these kind of shifts in, and it's not usually in preservation. It's like equitable development is usually either talked about in real estate or it can be talked about with developers, but we know as preservationists, there's very few practices. There's like historic tax credits can that tie into the development very directly. Adaptive reuse might be another opportunity, but it is really challenging to also you have to convince certain times. Sometimes it's the people who are living in these general areas that saving a building is and can be useful as opposed to demolishing and building something else when the potential yield could be very similar. Like you can both do redevelopment in a way that can create the housing needs and prevent that shortage. And so I feel like we combat this a lot in our work, really talking to people and having more conversations about what this really looks like in a scale to really be trying to make equitable change. But I think that the work that you do is just it's really diving into this in a very important way because there aren't a lot of people from what I've encountered in the field that are diving into Asian American histories like this.
Well, one thing I was thinking about in terms of equitable development, and I'm really interested in community land trusts and especially like family associations and all these sort of more traditional forms of co-ownership of cultural spaces in ethnic communities, or like rotating credit associations. There's all these interesting sort of different ways of owning property or sharing money or lending money. One thing I've been interested in is legacy businesses and legacy business programs and the way in
Mhm.
which they do and do not work well, and heritage conservation districts and all these other like newer kind of planning tools around preservation that are more interested in intangible
Yeah.
heritage. And I would say my sort of mission in life right now, I had this sort of like light bulb moment. My mission in life as a historian and an educator is to basically, through representation, through visibility of these stories and questions and ways of thinking, my job is to get as many young people thinking about it, whether or not it's their community or a community they're adjacent to. I always consider myself like adjacent to Chinatown, but I'm not Chinese. To
Mhm.
think about these things so that when a moment arises where maybe they have a little bit of power to make a decision about a building or space or business that's part of that community, they can maybe pause and think maybe there's a different way forward. So instead of the, well, we'll just have to remember it, this kind of feeling of defeatism, right? So this is just the way it is. By asking those questions and opening up other ways of thinking about the built landscape, it's like the stories that we tell ourselves and we tell our students, they will then go out and do what they need to do. But if they're not represented and the stories they care about are not shared or solicited anywhere, then
Mhm.
they will just fall back to that kind of dominant narrative of this is just social mobility and assimilation. Like, this is the American Canadian dream. And so I have so many students now who are doing amazing work. And I'm not going to say it's all due to me, but I'm saying there is this shift in higher education where there is visible representation of other people with other perspectives and other ways of knowing and doing things. And it's opening up these ideas. And I can't do these things for them, but I'm seeing them doing things differently, right? Like maybe their grandparent or their uncle owns a store and is thinking of selling or thinking of renting it to a Krispy Kreme, but maybe this kid has heard about all these things that are really interesting to them, and maybe they then say something to their uncle, right? Like
Right.
maybe we should rent to this person, or maybe I can turn it into a maker space, or maybe. And without that sort of broadening out and more equitable kind of representation of these perspectives, I think it is hard to imagine other future possibilities.
Yeah.
And maybe that's better than like a legacy business program, although I'm sure there's value to that as well. But
Right. Or kind of like that in itself could be an act of preservation, right? It
exactly.
doesn't always have to be the memorial, the monument. It can be like, hey, let's keep this in the family, or let's turn this into something we can preserve the legacy in different ways. And
Mhm.
I think, yeah, that more expansive view of preservation, I'm hopeful that
Yeah.
people will start to take on.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I think it's a great way to kind of wrap it up and
Yeah.
really just like say thank you, Erica. Thank you for being on here. Thank you for your book, your contributions to the field. It was really nice speaking with you today. Thank you for listening to this Urban Roots episode, and a huge thanks to Erica Allen Kim. Your hosts are me, Deqa Hussein Wetzel.
And me, Vanessa Quirk. This episode was edited by Decca, myself, and Skylar Ficklin, and mixed by Connor Lynch.
You can find us on Instagram at Urban Roots Culture or email us at urbanrootspodcast@gmail.com.
Urban Roots is part of the nonprofit Urbanist Media. If you like what we do, please consider contributing to our end of year giving campaign. Whether it's $5, $50, or $500, it helps. So please find us at PayPal or Venmo at Urbanist Media.
Or if you're a fan of Patreon, you can become a monthly subscriber for as little as $1 and get early access to new Urbanist Media content. You can find that link to the Patreon and the donation buttons on our website, urbanistmedia.org.
Okay, I think that's it. Decca, want to hit the good people with our tagline?
Urban Roots, preserving place through story.